You came up here, by the way, to the funeral, didn't you? Or was
Yes.
you here? Do you have any recollections of the funeral here in Jamestown?
I had a recollection of how beautiful it was up here. And what a nice, quiet section of the country was for him to have grown up here and really be a small country lawyer and then end up the way he had. I think it's really quite remarkable, and particularly in light of his lack of education. I mean, it's a wonderful story. I'm absolutely amazed that it hasn't been told more than it has.
Well, I guess that's our challenge.
Yeah.
You stayed on, after Jackson died, you stayed on and worked for John Marshall Harlan.
Well, I worked with Frankfurter first.
Yeah, okay. And you were asked by the Chief Justice to participate in the research for what would turn out to be Brown 2. In doing the research and in being part of the clerk process, did you get any feeling that you were maybe continuing to carry a torch of Justice Jackson as the Brown 2 order was being implemented? Did you feel any burden there at all?
Well, I was doing two things. Number one, for all of the justices, I was part of that pool that was doing research into various things totally outside the record. I mean, it was an interesting process that people have not commented upon very much. But my particular job was to see if I could get together maps of cities that showed where black and white people lived and where their schools were, and what kind of school systems they had, so as to see as a practical matter what we were dealing with in saying, hey, you've got to integrate the schools. The other part that I was doing was I had constant contact with Justice Harlan, who wanted everything he could get his hands on in regard to these cases, and he had asked me for a memo on what I thought the decree should look like. And what I concluded by then was that the school systems were far, far more complex than I had anticipated. I just thought that you went to the school nearest to where you lived and that was the end of it. But there were all kinds of systems in place throughout the country for establishing where people would go to school. And I didn't understand how we could come up with a decree that would cover all of these situations. And, but I did write a memo making rather extensive recommendations about what the decree might look like. So those were the two parts that I was working on more or less at the same time.
Would Jackson have been happy the way the order ultimately came out in Brown versus 2?
Well, I think he foresaw a lot of what I found, and that was that it was a far more complex factual situation than the people on the court had assumed, or in effect were assuming when they said, okay, it's unconstitutional. And as you know from his various drafts of his concurring opinion, he was very upset about what they actually ultimately did, and that was to turn it back to the district courts without much guidance as to how they were to proceed. He thought that that was unfair to the district judges. On the other hand, I had mixed emotions about it, because while I agreed with him that that had an element of unfairness in it, I also saw all the complexities of the systems and wondered how in the world, if the court was going to tell them how to do it, what in the world would it say that would meet all of these disparate systems? So I was pretty torn.
After you left your clerkship with Frankfurter and then Harlan, did you continue to follow that particular case and its legacy? Was that since you were part of it, you're intimately part of the birthing of Brown versus Board, Did you then have a kind of feel like a stake in it as well?
Yes and no. I followed it carefully in the papers, but I did not in any way try to get behind the public story. I didn't call up clerks and try to find out what was really going on or anything of that sort. I just didn't feel like that was my place. But I did have a great interest in how it was progressing. And I thought several strains that fascinated me. One was the slow conversion from simply getting rid of enforced segregation and moving into integration, which really was not part of the original decision. What the justices, I think, intended was to say you are to strike down enforced segregation wherever it appears, but they were not saying that you had to take steps to affirmatively integrate. But that came about through a very slow process, and I found that absolutely fascinating. And the other thing that I found fascinating and quite sad, of course, was the fact that segregation was not done away with in so many places, and that even today, 50 years later, we have integrated or segregated schools in so many places. And the whole history of how that came about and why, because you hear arguments that that really is a choice of many black people, that they would rather have their children in black schools rather than integrated. On the other hand, you see all kinds of things that are done in places to really enforce segregation again, or still. So that whole trend has fascinated me too. But only as an active observer, I mean, not as anyone who really knows anything other than what you read.
You were intimates with the Kennedys, and the Kennedys went through that certainly very tumultuous civil rights time. Was there a period of time where, because of your relationship, that you either were asked or kind of offered your thoughts on perhaps the best way to attack what was going on, whether it be Mississippi, whether it be...
Well, I was not actively involved in the civil rights, as, for example, Burt Marshall was. I did attend a number of meetings. I did go to Mississippi and Alabama with Bob. I was in on some of the meetings. I was there the day that he discovered for the first time that there were virtually no blacks on his staff at the Justice Department. And so I was on the periphery, really. I was not actively involved. I did some things on the edge, such as creating a huge playground in the middle of Washington, in the black section of Washington. That was Bobby's idea, and that the president wanted to push, and things like that. But I was not intimately involved in that aspect. I was supposed to be both Jackie's and the president's representative on the Interagency Committee for Transport Merges. I was supposed to be the transportation expert, which of course was absurd.